CEO marries an ugly beggar for a $100 million bet, but on their wedding night, he discovers something and is shocked. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Share your city in the comments and enjoy this emotional journey. The rain had a cruel way of reminding Isabella of everything she had lost. Cold and relentless, it hammered the streets of New York, turning the alleyways into rivers of filth. She sat curled against a brick wall, her thin coat soaked through, her fingers trembling as she clutched a piece of stale bread. People passed by, too busy with their own lives to notice the woman who had once been one of them. Once. There was a time when she had walked these streets wearing designer heels, when her name had commanded respect in boardrooms, when cameras had flashed at her presence. Now those same people wouldn't even spare her a glance. She was invisible. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Hunger had become a dull ache, just another part of her existence. She had learned to survive, to disappear into the backdrop of the city. It was safer that way. The less people saw her, the less she had to remember who she used to be. A car sped by, splashing dirty water onto her legs. Isabella flinched, but didn't move. She had learned that reacting only made it worse. If you acted like you didn't care, people stopped noticing you, and that was the only way to survive. Tonight, however, fate had other plans. A sleek black car pulled up across the street, its presence unnatural in this part of town. The tinted windows reflected the neon glow of a liquor store sign. Inside, a man sat, watching the world with the detachment of someone who owned it. Leonardo Ferraz. The name was synonymous with power. Billionaire, investor, ruthless businessman. He wasn't just rich, he was untouchable. His presence demanded attention wherever he went. And yet, in this moment, there was something unsettling in his stare. Leonardo wasn't sure what had drawn his gaze to the woman across the street. Maybe it was the way she didn't flinch when drenched by the passing car. Or maybe it was the distant familiarity in her posture. She was nothing. Just another homeless person blending into the filth of the city. And yet, something about her made him pause. "Sir?" his driver asked, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. Leonardo didn't answer. His fingers tapped against the leather seat. He wasn't a man who wasted time on distractions. But then he remembered the conversation from earlier that night. The bet. 100 million if he could marry a woman beneath him. Someone no one would ever expect. Someone so far removed from his world that it would be unthinkable. A cruel smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He opened the car door. The city never slept. It pulsed with life, wealth, and power. Everything that Leonardo Ferraz had in abundance. Yet, as he stepped out of his car, his polished Italian shoes meeting the grimy sidewalk, he felt nothing. He had built his empire from the ground up, turning ruthless deals into billion-dollar victories. People envied him, feared him, wanted to be him. Women threw themselves at him. Men sought his approval, and yet, in the silence of his penthouse, all of it felt meaningless. This bet, however, this was something different. "Sir, do you need assistance?" his driver asked. Stepping forward, his confusion evident. Leonardo never got out of the car for anyone. Leonardo ignored him. His sharp gaze remained locked on the woman curled against the brick wall. She was utterly still, as if she had trained herself to be invisible. For a moment, he hesitated. This was beneath him. He had been in exclusive clubs just hours ago, sipping whiskey that cost more than most people's rent. Now, he was standing in the middle of a rain-soaked street, staring at a homeless woman like she was a puzzle he needed to solve. But he didn't back away. He never backed away. "Get up," he said. His voice was cold, cutting through the noise of the city like a blade. Isabella didn't move. She had heard voices like his before. Sharp, entitled, dismissive. Men who thought they owned the world, who thought people like her were just obstacles in their way. She didn't need this. I said, "Get up." She lifted her head just enough to meet his gaze. Her eyes, once filled with fire, now held nothing but exhaustion. "Go to hell," she muttered. Leonardo let out a low chuckle. He wasn't used to being defied, especially not by someone in her position. She should be, groveling for any scrap of mercy he was willing to offer. Instead, She looked at him like he was the one who didn't belong. Interesting. He crouched down, leveling himself with her, though every fiber of his being screamed against it. The smell of the streets clung to her. Dirt, sweat, rain. But beneath it, something else lingered. A scent almost familiar. "I'm offering you a deal," he said smoothly. "Marriage, 1 year. You'll have food, shelter, anything you need. In return, you do exactly as I say." Isabella let out a short, humorless laugh. "Are you insane?" "Possibly," he smirked. "But I don't make offers twice." She stared at him, searching for the joke. When she found none, a flicker of something crossed her expression. Anger, disbelief, maybe even fear. Leonardo didn't move. He didn't beg. He had already decided that she was the one. She could say no and he would find someone. Find else. But something told him she wouldn't, because she was starving, because she was cold, because whatever pride she had left was already crumbling. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then finally, she spoke. "When do we start?" The city roared around them, honking taxis, flashing billboards, the murmurs of people huddling under awnings to escape the rain. But for Leonardo and Isabella, the world had narrowed to this moment. She had said yes. Leonardo stood slowly, wiping non-existent dust from his suit as if to remove the grime of the alley from himself. He expected to feel triumph, the same satisfaction that always came with winning. But as he looked down at Isabella, so thin, so wrecked by life, there was no sense of victory, just something foreign. A weight. Not that it mattered. He pulled his phone from his coat pocket and dialed. "Lucas, get the paperwork ready." A pause. "For what?" came the hesitant reply. Leonardo glanced at Isabella, her arms crossed, her body rigid with distrust. "For my wedding." The silence on the other end was deafening. "Sir?" "Now." He ended the call before his assistant could sputter out whatever objection was forming. This wasn't up for debate. The moment she said yes, the game was set in motion. Isabella shifted her weight, hugging her coat tighter around herself. "You didn't even ask my name." Leonardo arched a brow. "Do you think I care?" She let out a slow exhale, shaking her head. Of course not. It was better this way. If he asked, if he cared, it would humanize her. And Leonardo Ferraz did not attach himself to things that could be discarded. "Get in the car." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because unless you want to stay out here and rot, we have a wedding to plan." Isabella looked past him, her eyes sweeping over the streets, the shadows, the gutters, the people who ignored her. Then, without another word, she moved toward the car. The driver glanced at Leonardo in uncertainty, but Leonardo only gave a slight nod. The door was opened, and Isabella hesitantly climbed in. She expected the luxury of the car to make her feel relief. Warm leather seats, soft lighting, the absence of the wet pavement beneath her. But it only made her more aware of the dirt under her fingernails, the stench of the streets clinging to her skin. She didn't belong here. But if Leonardo noticed, or cared, he didn't show it. He took his seat beside her, legs crossed, one hand adjusting his cufflink as if this were just another business transaction. And to him, it was. "This arrangement," he said smoothly, "will last 1 year. You will be given everything you need: clothes, food, shelter. You will not question me, and you will not interfere in my life." She snorted. "Believe me, the last thing I want is to be in your life." Leonardo ignored the remark. "In return, you will play the role of my wife in public. Appearances must be maintained." Isabella's fingers curled around the frayed hem of her sleeve. "And after a year, I'll pay you well enough to disappear." She turned her head to the window, watching as the city blurred past. This was insanity. She had agreed to something that made no sense, all for the promise of warmth, of food, of not having to fight for survival. But what did it matter? She had nothing left to lose, and maybe that was why she was the perfect choice. Hours later, Leonardo's penthouse. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Isabella stepped out cautiously, her feet sinking into the plush carpet of Leonardo's penthouse. The air smelled like expensive cologne and polished wood, a stark contrast to the damp and filth she was used to. She didn't belong here, but here she was. Leonardo shrugged off his coat and tossed it to a waiting assistant, who barely glanced at Isabella before disappearing into another room. "This is where you'll live," he said, gesturing vaguely. "You have everything you need. Don't touch my things." She let out a humorless laugh. "Oh, don't worry. The last thing I want is anything that belongs to you." He smirked, as if entertained by her resistance. But she saw the amusement flicker into something else, something unreadable. Leonardo liked control. He liked predictability, and she was anything but predictable. She turned away, her eyes scanning the endless luxury. Marble floors, a skyline view, walls lined with books she doubted he had ever read. And then, her stomach twisted, a mirror. For the first time in months, she saw herself. Her breath caught. The woman staring back at her was a stranger. Hollow cheeks, sunken eyes, hair matted beyond recognition. There was no trace of the woman she had once been. Leonardo, noticing her silence, followed her gaze. "You'll be cleaned up before the ceremony," he said flatly. Isabella tore her eyes away from the mirror, her jaw tightening. Of course. He wasn't marrying her. He was reconstructing her, and she hated him for. Later, that night, a private lounge. The laughter of powerful men filled the air, mingling with the clink of whiskey glasses. Leonardo sat among them, his posture effortless, his smirk barely concealing the sharp amusement in his eyes. "You're actually going through with it?" one of his friends, Victor, scoffed. Leonardo swirled his drink lazily. "What? You thought I wouldn't?" The men exchanged glances before bursting into laughter. "You're insane," Victor said, shaking his head. God, Leo, she's barely human. What the hell are you thinking?" Leonardo simply leaned back, enjoying their discomfort. He had already won. They just didn't know it yet. Victor smirked, leaning in. "And what happens on the wedding night? You actually plan on—" Leonardo's gaze darkened, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I don't pay you to think, Victor." The air shifted. For all their wealth and bravado, they knew better than to push Leonardo Ferraz too far. Victor raised his hands in surrender, laughing again. All right. I just hope she doesn't stab you in your sleep." Leonardo only smiled. He wasn't worried about that. Not yet. Back at the penthouse, Isabella sat on the edge of the massive bed, staring at the untouched tray of food in front of her. It smelled divine. Her stomach was too knotted to eat. She had made a deal with the devil, and tomorrow she would become his wife. She had no idea what terrified her more, the thought of what she had agreed to, or the feeling that somehow Leonardo Ferraz already knew who she was. The world inside Leonardo Ferraz's penthouse was a stark contrast to the one Isabella had been living in. Marble floors stretched across the massive space, reflecting the city lights from the floor-to-ceiling windows. A grand chandelier dripped with crystal, casting golden hues against the walls. Every inch of the place screamed wealth, cold, calculated, unattainable wealth. And she didn't belong here. Isabella stood near the entrance, still dripping from the rain. The heat from the room pressed against her frozen skin, but it did nothing to ease the numbness spreading through her chest. She had made a deal with the devil, and now she was inside his kingdom. Leonardo poured himself a drink at the bar, acting as if this situation was the most natural thing in the world, as if bringing a homeless woman into his home and offering her marriage was just another Tuesday. "Take a shower," he ordered, not even sparing her a glance. "I can't have you looking like that when we make this official." She didn't move. "You're insane if you think I'm actually going to marry you," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. Leonardo finally turned to her, eyes sharp. "You already agreed. Or did you forget?" Isabella clenched her jaw. No, she hadn't forgotten. But she also hadn't expected to be standing in a billionaire's penthouse, dripping rain onto his expensive floor, while he acted like this was some kind of twisted business transaction. Because that's exactly what it was. She wasn't here because he cared. She wasn't here because he saw something in her. She was here because she was a game, a bet. "What's in this for you?" she asked, crossing her arm. Leonardo took a slow sip of his drink, his smirk lazy and infuriating. "Does it matter?" "Yes," she snapped. "It matters." For a second, something flickered behind his eyes. something dark. But just as quickly, it was gone, replaced by amusement. $100 million, he admitted. That's what's in it for me. The words hit her harder than they should have. Of course, she was a joke. A walking, breathing joke between him and his rich friends. Isabella's fists tightened at her sides, but she forced herself to stay still. She had been humiliated before. She had been thrown away before, but this time, she would survive it. She lifted her chin, her pride the only thing she had left. Then, let's get this over with. Leonardo chuckled, setting his glass down. I knew I liked you. The wedding was a mockery. No guests, no vows, no sentiment. Just a cold, impersonal exchange in a private office with a lawyer who barely looked up from his paperwork. Leonardo slid a ring onto her finger, an expensive diamond that didn't belong on her hand. The metal felt foreign, too heavy, as if it was burning into her skin. Congratulations, the lawyer said without emotion. You are now legally husband and wife. Isabella's stomach turned. Leonardo smirked, leaning in just enough to whisper, Try to look happy, querida. You're a billionaire's wife now. Her nails dug into her palm. She hated him. She hated the way he said it, like she was lucky, like he had saved her. She would prove to him, prove to all of them, that they had made a mistake choosing her as their entertainment. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The ride back to the penthouse was silent. Leonardo sat beside her in the limousine, legs crossed, fingers casually tapping against his knee. He looked completely at ease, as if he hadn't just married a woman who had been sleeping on the streets hours ago. Isabella, on the other hand, was suffocating. The diamond on her finger felt like a shackle, and the realization of what she had done crashed over her like a wave. She had married a man she despised. She had sold herself into a life she didn't belong to, all because hunger and exhaustion had forced her hand. It was temporary, she reminded herself. A year. That was what they agreed on. 1 year of being Leonardo Ferraz's wife. Then she would be free. The limousine pulled into the underground parking lot of his building, and within minutes, she was stepping back into the cold, polished luxury of his home. It was eerily quiet, the vastness of the penthouse swallowing her whole. Leonardo loosened his tie, throwing his suit jacket onto the couch. He looked her up and down, his smirk unwavering. You clean up well, he said. She had been forced into a wedding dress before the ceremony, something sleek and elegant that barely felt like her own skin. The stylist had scrubbed the dirt from her body, brushed out her tangled hair, and covered the dark circles under her eyes with expensive makeup. But no amount of polish could erase what she had been through, and Leonardo knew it. She squared her shoulders. Are we done? Now? He tilted his head. We're married, querida. That means there's one more thing left to do. Her stomach twisted. If he touched her, I'll take the guest room, he said, breaking the tension. You can have the master suite. This was never about that. She blinked. What? Leonardo let out a low. Leonardo let chuckle, shaking his head. You really think I'd sleep with you? The humiliation burned hot. He wasn't just playing a game. He was making sure she knew exactly how beneath him she was. Isabella forced her chin up. Good, she said. I wouldn't touch you either. His smirk widened, amused by her defiance. Then we're in agreement, he said. This is just business. He turned to leave, but something in her voice stopped him. This isn't the first time you've done something like this, is it? Leonardo stilled. For the first time since they met, the air between them shifted. His jaw clenched. For just a fraction of a second. So fast that anyone else might have missed it. But Isabella saw it. A flicker of something in his eyes. It wasn't just arrogance. It wasn't just control. It was recognition. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. She had spent years on the streets, living in shadows, avoiding people who might recognize her from her past life. But now, looking at him, standing in this gilded cage of wealth and power, a terrible thought struck her. Had they met before? Leonardo turned away, his voice smooth again. Get some rest, wife. You'll need it. Then he disappeared. Down the hall, leaving her alone with a question that refused to leave her mind. Who was Leonardo Ferraz to her? And why did he look at her like he already knew the answer? The penthouse was suffocating. Isabella sat on the edge of the massive bed, staring at the glistening city skyline through the window. The sheets were silk, the pillows fluffed to perfection, but none of it felt real. It was too quiet, too still. She was used to the hum of the streets, the distant sirens, the murmur of people who had nothing and no one. But here, in Leonardo Ferraz's world, silence was a weapon, a reminder of just how alone she was. And yet, her mind wasn't on the present. It was stuck on him, that look in his eyes. She had spent years training herself to forget. Forget the people, the faces, the betrayals. But Leonardo, something about him was pulling at memories she had buried long ago. Had she seen him before? Was it in the past life she had lost? She shook her head, gripping the sheets in frustration. It didn't matter. She was nothing to him. Just a game, a bet. And yet, why did she feel like he knew something she didn't? In the kitchen, Leonardo stood by the counter, pouring himself another drink. His fingers tapped against the glass as he stared at nothing. He hadn't planned on feeling anything. This was supposed to be easy, an effortless win. But the moment he saw her up close, the shape of her eyes, the way her lips pressed together when she was trying to hide her emotions, his mind had snapped back to a time he had long since buried. He had met her before, a long time ago, and if she ever remembered who he was, his jaw tightened. It didn't matter. She was a pawn in a game he never lost. And by the time she figured out the truth, it would be too late. Morning came, but it brought no warmth. Isabella stepped into the vast dining area, her bare feet hesitant against the cold marble floor. She wasn't used to moving through places like this anymore, where everything was polished, untouched by struggle. Leonardo sat at the head of the long glass table, sipping his coffee like a man with no worries in the world. His shirt was crisp, the sleeves rolled up just enough to show the gold watch on his wrist. She hated that he looked so put together while she felt like she was unraveling. "You slept?" he asked, barely looking at her. "Not really," she said flatly. He smirked. "Afraid I'd sneak into your bed?" She grabbed an apple from the bowl in the center of the table. "No, just trying to remember where I've seen you before." His fingers froze around his cup. It was quick, barely noticeable, but she noticed. He recovered fast, setting his coffee down with a casual shrug. "I do have one of those faces." "No," she said, stepping closer, her eyes narrowing. "It's more than that." Leonardo leaned back in his chair, amusement flickering in his gaze. "If you say so, querida." She clenched the apple in her hand. "Who are you, Leonardo?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your husband," he said. And just like that, the conversation was over. But inside, Isabella knew the truth. Leonardo Ferraz was hiding something, and she was going to find out what. The day passed in a blur of silence. Leonardo had left early, vanishing into whatever empire he ruled, leaving Isabella alone in the penthouse. She had expected it. A man like him didn't waste time on things that didn't serve him directly. Still, the absence gave her space to think. Something about him wasn't right. That flicker of recognition in his eyes, it had been real. She was sure of it. But why wouldn't he just admit it? She had spent years on the streets, perfecting the art of survival. And if there was one thing she had learned, it was that people only hid the truth when it was dangerous, which meant whatever Leonardo was keeping from her, it mattered. Hours later, the front door swung open. Leonardo walked in, loosening his tie, his movements sharp and methodical. He barely acknowledged her presence as he moved toward the bar. "Busy day?" she asked, watching him. He poured himself a drink. "Always." She leaned against the counter, studying him. "Where do I fit into all this?" He took a slow sip of whiskey. "You don't." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Then why bother marrying me?" Leonardo's smirk was lazy, but his eyes were unreadable. "Because I don't lose." The words sent a chill through her. This wasn't just about the bet, it was about control. And something told her that whatever game he was playing, she wasn't the only one being. That night, unable to sleep, she wandered the penthouse, the quiet pressing against her like a weight. The place was too perfect, too curated. Except for one thing. A door. Locked. Her heart pounded as she reached for the handle, testing it gently. It didn't budge. Why lock a single room in an apartment that was otherwise open? She pressed her ear against the wood, listening. Silence. Then, a faint rustling inside. Someone had been in there. She stepped back, her pulse racing. Leonardo had secrets. And whatever was behind that door, it might just destroy them both. The locked door haunted her. Isabella had spent the past few years learning when to ignore things. Hunger, pain, the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. But this? This wasn't something she could ignore. Leonardo had secrets. That much she knew. And whatever he was hiding behind that, daughter was part of them. She waited until the penthouse was silent, listening for the sound of his breathing down the hall. When she was sure he was asleep, she slipped out of bed, padding barefoot across the cold floor. The door was still there, still locked. Her fingers traced the handle, frustration bubbling inside her. She needed to know what was inside. But before she could step away, a voice cut through the darkness. "You don't give up, do you?" She spun around. Leonardo stood in the hallway, shirt unbuttoned at the top, sleeves rolled up. His eyes were sharp despite the late hour, his presence radiating control. Isabella's heart pounded, but she lifted her chin. "Why is it locked?" He took a slow step closer. "Why do you care?" "Because you're hiding something." Leonardo smirked, tilting his head. "And what makes you think it has anything to do with you?" She swallowed. "I don't know." His gaze held hers for a long moment, assessing, calculating. Then, in one fluid motion, he pulled a key from his pocket. Isabella's breath caught as he slid it into the lock. The door clicked open. She expected a grand reveal, something shocking. Instead, she stepped into a dimly lit room lined with bookshelves. A desk sat in the corner, neat and untouched. The air smelled faintly of dust and something familiar, something she couldn't quite place. She turned to him, confused. "A study?" Leonardo leaned against the doorway, watching her. "Disappointed?" She frowned, running her fingers along the desk. Papers were stacked in perfect piles, but there was nothing unusual, nothing that explained why he had locked it away. Then she saw it. A single photograph. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. The edges were slightly worn, as if it had been handled many times. It was a picture of a girl with her face. The world tilted beneath her feet. She turned to Leonardo, her voice barely a whisper. "Who the hell are you?" He stared at her, his expression unreadable. And then, for the first time since they met, Leonardo Ferraz hesitated. The silence was suffocating. Isabella stood frozen, the photograph trembling in her grip. The girl in the picture, her, was younger, untouched by the years of suffering that had followed. But it was undeniably her. She had no memory of this photo being taken, no memory of Leonardo ever being in her life. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned to face him. "Explain." Leonardo remained in the doorway, his face unreadable, his body as still as stone. But she saw it. The slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled ever so slightly at his side. For the first time, Leonardo Ferraz looked trapped. "I told you," he said smoothly, though his voice lacked its usual arrogance. "You ask too many questions." Isabella stepped closer, holding up the photograph. "Where did you get this?" A slow exhale left him. He didn't answer. That only made her anger flare hotter. "You knew me before," she accused, her voice sharp. "Didn't you?" His silence was confirmation enough. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. All this time, she had believed their meeting was random, that she had been nothing more than a game to him, a pawn in his sick little bet. But it had never been random. He had known exactly who she was. Her fingers clenched around the photo. "Tell me the truth, Leonardo." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, something dark. Then, in one fluid motion, he snatched the photograph from her grip, setting it back on the desk with eerie calmness. "You're tired," he said. "Go to bed." She let out a bitter laugh. "You're not going to talk your way out of this." "I don't have to." His voice was controlled, but the steel in it was unmistakable. "You agreed to this marriage, Isabella. You took the deal. You don't get to start questioning me now." Her heart slammed against her ribs. So that's it? You're just going to keep lying? Leonardo took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. Lies, he murmured, are a matter of perspective. She refused to back down. You knew me. Before the streets. Before all of this. He tilted his head, watching her. Maybe. A cold shiver ran down her spine. Who were you to me? She whispered. Leonardo held her gaze for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked away. She was left standing alone in the dimly lit study, heart pounding, the truth still just out of reach. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a bet, and Leonardo Ferraz wasn't just a stranger. Sleep never came. Isabella lay in the massive bed, staring at the ceiling. The photograph burned into her mind. Leonardo had known her before. She didn't know how, she didn't know when, but it was undeniable now. And the fact that he refused to admit it? That was what scared her the most. Because men, like Leonardo Ferraz, didn't just keep secrets. They buried them. And she had the sinking feeling that she was one of them. Morning came, but the tension from the night before remained. Leonardo sat at the dining table, reading the newspaper, looking as composed as ever. If last night had rattled him, he didn't show it. Isabella sat across from him, watching, waiting. The silence stretched between them until she finally broke it. You're really not going to say anything about last night? Leonardo turned a page in his newspaper. What about last night? Her nails dug into her palm. The photograph. The fact that you've been lying to me since the moment we met. He finally looked up, his expression maddeningly calm. Lying is a strong word, Carrie. She slammed her hand on the table. Enough of the games, Leonardo. I deserve the truth. Something flickered in his eyes. Something dangerous. He set the newspaper down with slow precision, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. You deserve the truth? His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the sharp edge beneath it. You, who kept your past buried like a dirty little secret. You, who pretended to be just another nameless face on the streets. Her breath caught. I never pretended to be anything. No? His smirk was humorless. Then why don't you tell me, Isabella, who you really are? A cold dread slithered down her spine. Because the truth was, she didn't know anymore. Not fully. Her past was a blur of pain and loss, a life ripped away from her so brutally that she had forced herself to forget. But Leonardo remembered. And that was why he was dangerous. She swallowed hard. I lost everything. Her voice was quieter now, steadier. Who I was doesn't matter anymore. Leonardo studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he let out a low chuckle. You really believe that, don't you? She glared at him. I know it. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Then why are you so desperate for answers? Her jaw tightened. She wasn't going to let him turn this on her. I will find out the truth, Leonardo, she said, pushing back her chair. With or without you. Leonardo watched her go, his smirk fading the second she disappeared down the hall. Because if she kept digging, she wouldn't just find the truth. She'd find out what he did. And there was no coming back from that. The city stretched endlessly below the penthouse windows, bathed in the golden glow of dusk. But inside, the air was suffocating. Isabella couldn't stop thinking about Leonardo's words. Then why don't you tell me who you really are? It wasn't just arrogance. It wasn't just a game. He knew something. And if he wasn't going to tell her, she would find out herself. She waited until he left for the evening. Leonardo's life was meticulously scheduled. Meetings, business dinners, deals that kept his empire intact. That gave her exactly 2 hours to search the penthouse before he returned. She started in his study, the only place that had shown even a glimpse of his secrets. The locked room had been a dead end, at least at first. But she had seen the way he guarded that photograph. She pulled open the desk drawers, flipping through stacks of neatly arranged documents. Financial, records, contracts, real estate deals, nothing personal, nothing real. Her frustration grew. Leonardo wasn't human. He was a machine, a man who built walls so high no one could reach inside. Until a folder, thick, old, hidden beneath a stack of useless paperwork. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. And then, Her heart stopped. New York Times. October 3rd, 8 years ago. Billionaire heir killed in tragic accident. The Faraz legacy in mourning. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes scanned the article, devouring every word. Matteo Faraz, son of business mogul Eduardo Faraz, was pronounced dead in a tragic car accident late last night. Sources say the young heir lost control of his vehicle near the Brooklyn Bridge. The family has declined to comment on the incident, though insiders claim the Faraz name will never be the same. Matteo Faraz. She didn't recognize the name, but when she looked at the attached photo, her blood turned to ice. Because standing next to the man in the picture was her. The door slammed. Isabella jumped, shoving the papers back into the drawer just as heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Leonardo. He entered the study like a storm. Coat draped over his arm, tie loosened, eyes sharp and knowing. Her pulse pounded. Did he see her searching? Did he know what she had just discovered? Enjoying yourself? He asked, his voice casual, but laced with something dangerous. She forced herself to breathe, to act normal. I was just looking for something to read. Leonardo's gaze flickered to the desk, where the papers had been just seconds ago. The silence stretched. Then, finally, he smirked. You should have asked, he said. I could have recommended something. She swallowed hard, nodding, before brushing past him and out the door, but as she hurried down the hallway, her mind was screaming. Who was Matteo Faraz? And why was she standing next to him in a photograph from 8 years ago? Isabella locked herself in the master bedroom, her heart racing. She leaned against the door, pressing her hands to her face, willing herself to stay calm. But there was no calming the storm raging inside her. The newspaper article, the photograph, the name Matteo Faraz. 8 years ago she had been, in that picture, standing next to a man she didn't remember. A man who was supposedly dead. And Leonardo. He had seen the article. He had watched her read it. And he hadn't said a word. He knew. He had always known. She didn't sleep that night. By the time morning came, she had only one goal. Answers. Leonardo was already seated at the dining table when she walked in, coffee in hand, flipping through his newspaper as if the world hadn't just shattered beneath her feet. He glanced up when she entered, smirking. You look terrible. She ignored the comment, walking straight to him. Who is Matteo? Faraz? The smirk vanished. It was subtle. A flicker of something behind his eyes. But it was there. He took a slow sip of his coffee, as if choosing his words carefully. Then he set the cup down with precision. I see you've been keeping yourself entertained. Answer the question, she demanded. Leonardo leaned back in his chair, studying her. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Then, finally, he said, He was my brother. Her stomach dropped. Brother. 1,000 thoughts crashed through her mind at once. Leonardo had never mentioned a sibling. There were no news. Articles about another Faraz son, only Matteo who had died in that accident. And yet, there she was, in the picture, next to him. She pulled out the chair across from him, gripping the table. Then why was I with him? Leonardo didn't blink. That's the real question, isn't it? The way he said, it, the sharpness in his tone, sent a chill down her spine. You knew me, she whispered, before I lost everything. Leonardo exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the table. Then, finally, he said, Yes. Isabella's world tilted. This was it. The confirmation she had been waiting for. She had been part of their world once. And something had happened. Something big enough to make her forget. Something big enough that Leonardo had lied to her about it all this time. Her voice was barely a whisper. What happened to me? Leonardo leaned forward, his gaze dark and unreadable. Be careful what you wish for, querida. She swallowed hard. Tell me. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally he said, You were supposed to be dead too. The world blurred. Isabella gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white, as Leonardo's words echoed in her mind. You were supposed to be dead too. The room felt suddenly too small. The air, too thick. She stared at him, her heart pounding. What the hell does that mean? Leonardo's expression was unreadable, but there was something behind his eyes, something dangerous. It means, he said slowly, That the accident that killed my brother was supposed to kill you too. Isabella's breath caught. No, that wasn't possible. She barely remembered the years before the streets. Her past was a tangled mess of half-forgotten memories, things she had forced herself to forget just to survive. But this? She would have remembered this, wouldn't she? I don't believe you, she whispered. Leonardo smirked, but it wasn't amused. It was cold. You don't have to, but the fact that you're alive, that you've been living in the shadows all these years, that's proof enough. Her head spun. She had spent years thinking she was just another nobody, a woman who had lost everything. But if what Leonardo was saying was true, she had been part of something bigger, something that someone had tried to erase, and Leonardo had known the entire time. She slammed her hands on the table. Why didn't you tell me? His jaw tightened. For the first time, his carefully crafted mask cracked. Because if you had remembered who you were, he said quietly, you wouldn't have survived. The weight. His words settled over her like a heavy fog. She wasn't just some woman who had fallen through the cracks. She was a threat to someone, and that someone had tried to kill her. Isabella's fingers trembled as she pushed back from the table. She felt sick, like the ground beneath her had just crumbled. Away. Leonardo watched her, his gaze steady. Now you understand. She shook her head. No, I don't. Because none of this makes sense. She pointed at him, her voice shaking. Why bring me here? Why marry me if you knew all of this? For the first time, Leonardo hesitated. Then slowly, he stood, closing the distance between them. I needed to know, he murmured. If you remembered, if you still knew too much. Her blood ran cold. His marriage proposal, the bet. It had never been random. He had been watching her, testing her. This whole time, she had thought she was the pawn in his game. But she wasn't. She was the target. She stepped back, her voice barely a whisper. You were making sure I stayed dead. Leonardo didn't deny it. And that, more than anything, shattered her. The air between them was poisoned. Isabella couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The walls of the penthouse, once just a prison of luxury, now felt like they were closing in around her. Leonardo had known. He had known who she was, known that she had been meant to die in that accident. And instead of telling her, he had married her. Every touch, every glance, every word exchanged between them. It had all been calculated. She had never been his wife. She had been his test. And now that she knew the truth, what happened next? Leonardo was watching her. His eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that burned. He wasn't denying it. He wasn't even trying to explain himself. And that was the most painful part. Her voice was barely a whisper. You were making sure I didn't remember, that I stayed gone. He didn't flinch. You needed to stay dead, he said simply. The words sliced through her. She let out a hollow laugh, shaking her head. And yet, you married me. What was that, Leonardo? Some twisted way of controlling the situation? Leonardo exhaled, his fingers flexing at his sides. I told you from the beginning, Isabella. I don't lose. Her stomach turned. She had been a game to him. Was I just another business deal? She spat. Just another move on your chessboard? His jaw clenched. Silence. And then, his mask cracked. Leonardo took a slow step toward her. No, he said. The word hit her like a gunshot, because it wasn't a lie. For the first time since she met him, he wasn't playing games. Her breath caught in her throat. If she had been just a test, if she had been just a game, then why was there hesitation in his eyes? Why did he look like a man torn in two? Why did he look like a man who had fallen into his own trap? Her heart slammed against her ribs. Leonardo. Faraz was a master of control. A man who never let emotions dictate his decisions. And yet standing here, facing the truth he had kept from her, he looked like he was afraid. She swallowed hard. Then what am I? A long silence. Then finally his voice dropped to a whisper. The one thing I can't afford to want. Her breath hitched. She should have hated him. Should have walked away. But she couldn't move. Because if she had been a game, then he had just lost. And she wasn't sure either of them would survive what came next. The world outside the penthouse was alive. Cars speeding down Fifth Avenue, voices rising and falling in the streets below. But inside, time had stopped. Isabella couldn't move. Leonardo's words hung in the air, suffocating. The one thing I can't afford to want. She should have laughed in his face. Should have told him that whatever twisted thing he felt didn't matter. That nothing he said could erase the fact that he had lied to her, manipulated her, tested her like she was some kind of experiment. But she didn't. Because the way he was looking at her, like he had lost control. And Leonardo and Faraz never lost control. The silence between them stretched, heavy and unbearable. Finally, Isabella spoke. "You don't get to say that," she whispered. Leonardo didn't blink. "Say what?" "That you want me." The words burned on her tongue. "Not after everything." Something dark flickered in his eyes. "I didn't plan for this," he admitted. His voice was quieter now, almost like he hated saying the words out loud. "You were supposed to be just another loose end." She flinched. He saw it, and for the first time, he looked like he regretted it. Isabella swallowed hard. "Then why didn't you just kill me?" Leonardo's entire body tensed. His hands clenched at his sides. And then, in a low, raw voice, he said, "Because I couldn't." The world tilted. Isabella felt something inside her shatter. This wasn't just about the past anymore. This was about them. About the man who had brought her into his world only to keep her in the dark. The man who had watched her suffer, who had toyed with her, who had kept the truth from her at every turn. And yet, he had saved her, again and again, even when he hadn't meant to, even when it went against everything he stood for. Her heart pounded. "What are you saying?" Leonardo exhaled slowly, his fingers flexing. Then, finally, he looked at her. "I'm saying," he paused, jaw tight, "that I don't know how to let you go." Her chest ached. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't love. But it was the closest thing to the truth she had gotten from him. And that terrified her more than anything else. Because if Leonardo Faraz, the man who played God with people's lives, didn't know how to let her go, then she wasn't sure she would ever escape him. Or worse, that she would ever want to. The rain drummed against the penthouse windows, filling the silence between them. Isabella sat on the edge of the couch, her mind spinning, her heart still hammering from Leonardo's words. "I don't know how to let you go." He hadn't said he loved, he hadn't even said he cared, but he had admitted something. And Leonardo Faraz didn't admit things easily. She should have run, should have walked away, should have reminded herself of all the reasons she hated him. But she stayed, because no one had ever fought this hard to keep her alive before, not even herself. The quiet stretched between them, charged with something unspoken. Leonardo finally broke it, standing up and adjusting the cuff of his shirt. "I have a meeting," he said, his voice calm, collected, like he hadn't just shattered the delicate balance between them. Isabella scoffed, shaking her head. "Of course you do." His lips twitched. "What? You thought I'd confess my undying devotion and throw myself at your feet?" She rolled her eyes. "You'd rather die first." He smirked. "Exactly." And just like that, the tension cracked. Just for a moment. But it wasn't gone. Not really. Leonardo grabbed his coat, heading toward the door. But before he stepped out, he glanced at her over his shoulder. "Stay here." It wasn't a request. Isabella narrowed her eyes. "Or what?" His gaze darkened, something unspoken flashing behind his eyes. "Or I'll come find you." The threat wasn't empty, and for some reason the way he said it made her stomach flip. Then he was gone, leaving her alone in the silence. She didn't stay, because if there was one thing she knew, it was that Leonardo Faraz wasn't the only one keeping secrets, and it was time to find out the rest. She grabbed her coat and slipped out of the penthouse, taking the private elevator down to the lobby. She had spent days locked in that glass tower, suffocated by unanswered questions. But tonight, she was done waiting. She needed to know who she had been before the accident, and there was only one person who might have the answers. It took an hour to find the address. A brownstone in the Upper East Side, tucked away behind iron gates. The kind of place that whispered old money and secrets buried beneath designer rugs. Isabella hesitated at the door. Then she knocked. Seconds later, it swung open. A woman stood there, tall, elegant, eyes sharp as glass. And the second she saw Isabella, her face went pale. "My God," she breathed. "You're alive." The world tilted. Isabella swallowed hard. "Who are you?" The woman stepped back, letting her inside. "I," she said softly, "am the only one who ever tried to save you." The brownstone smelled of old books and faded perfume, the kind of scent that clung to wealth and secrets alike. Isabella stepped inside cautiously, her pulse pounding. The woman closed the door behind her, studying her with wide, disbelieving eyes. "You don't remember me," she said quietly. Isabella swallowed hard. "Should I?" A sad smile tugged at the woman's lips. "Yes, but I suppose that's exactly what they wanted." Isabella's stomach twisted. "They." She forced herself to stay calm. "Who are you?" The woman exhaled slowly before finally saying, "My name is Victoria Ferraz." Over. Now the real game began. Ferraz. Like Leonardo. Like Matteo. Isabella took a step back. "You're related to them." Victoria nodded. "I'm their aunt." The blood drained from Isabella's face. This wasn't just a stranger. This was someone who had been part of their world. Someone who might finally give her the answers Leonardo refused to. She took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Then tell me," she said, her voice firm. "Who was I?" Victoria hesitated. Then she walked toward a cabinet, pulling out an old leather-bound photo album. She set it down on the table, flipping through pages that smelled of dust and time. And then, there she was. A photograph of herself. Not broken, not forgotten. Smiling. Alive. She was standing beside a man. Matteo. Her fingers trembled as she touched the image. They looked happy. She lifted her gaze, eyes burning. "I knew him." Victoria nodded. "You loved him." The words knocked the breath from her lungs. Loved. Her heart pounded. "Tell me everything." Victoria exhaled, her gaze darkening. 8 years ago, you and Matteo were engaged. Isabella's body went rigid. Engaged? No, that wasn't possible. She would have remembered something like that, wouldn't she? But even as she tried to reject it, the truth was staring back at her from the photograph. The way Matteo was holding her, the way she was looking at him. She had been his. And then, just like that, he had died. Tears burned her eyes. "What happened to me?" Victoria hesitated. Then, finally, she said, "Matteo was murdered. And they tried to kill you too." The room spun. "No. No. No. No." Isabella stumbled back, shaking her head. "It was an accident." Victoria's expression hardened. "That's what they wanted you to believe." Her breath came in short gasps. This wasn't real. Leonardo had told her she was supposed to be dead. That much she had accepted. But murder? Her chest ached. "Who?" she whispered. "Who tried to kill us?" Victoria's expression was grave. She placed a hand over Isabella's, her grip steady. And then, in a voice that sent ice through Isabella's veins, she said, "Leonardo." The world came crashing down. Isabella's knees went weak, and she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. "Leonardo." Victoria's words echoed in her head, but they didn't make sense. They couldn't. Leonardo Ferraz had lied. He had manipulated her, tested her, used her like a pawn in his twisted game. But this? Murder? No. Isabella shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're wrong." Victoria's gaze didn't waver. "I wish I were." The room was spinning. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. Leonardo had been cold, calculated, but he had saved her, again and again. If he had wanted her dead, why hadn't he just finished the job? She forced herself to breathe. "Tell me everything." Victoria exhaled. Matteo was supposed to take over the Ferraz empire. He was different from Leonardo. He had a heart. He wanted to change things, to cut ties with the men their father had built deals with. But powerful people don't like change. She flipped to another page in the album. More photos of Matteo, smiling, carefree, and beside him, her past self, a woman who had been loved, who had belonged. Victoria's voice was quieter now. You and Matteo were engaged. He adored you. That made you a target. Isabella's chest tightened. A target. Leonardo. Her throat was dry. He wouldn't... Victoria's expression darkened. Wouldn't he? Images flashed through Isabella's mind. Leonardo's control. His ruthless way of handling people. The way he had stalked her, tested her, played with her like she was nothing more than a game. But there had been something else too. Something behind his eyes. Something that had kept him from pulling the trigger. Something that had made him marry her instead of killing her. She swallowed hard. He said I was supposed to be dead. Victoria nodded. Because you were. A chill ran down Isabella's spine. Matteo found out something, Victoria continued. Something dangerous. He was going to walk away from the Faraz Empire. For you. He told me he had proof of their crimes. That he was going to expose everything. Isabella's heart pounded. And then he died. Yes. Victoria's voice was barely above a whisper. And you were in that car with him. The words slammed into her like a wrecking ball. The accident. The thing she had forced herself to forget. She could barely breathe. I survived, she choked out. Victoria's grip tightened. Around her hands. Yes. But someone made sure you wouldn't remember. Isabella's breath caught. Memories flashed in fragmented pieces. Pain, cold metal, the scent of blood. And then, nothing. She had woken up on the streets with no past, and no name, because someone had stolen them from her. She looked up, fear and rage swirling inside her. Who? Victoria hesitated, and then softly she said, Leonardo. The ground disappeared beneath her. No, it wasn't possible. Leonardo had played games with her. He had lied. But he had saved her too. Hadn't he? She thought of the way he looked at her. The way he had hesitated when she pushed him for the truth. The way he had said, I don't know how to let you go. A sickening thought crept into her mind. Had he been protecting her all this time? Or had he been keeping her under control? Her hands trembled. She needed answers. Now. She turned toward the door, her pulse hammering. Victoria grabbed her wrist. Isabella, wait. If he knows you remember... But Isabella wasn't listening. She was already running into the storm, straight back to the man who had stolen her past. And maybe, just maybe, her future, too. The storm raged as Isabella ran through the city, rain soaking through her clothes. But she didn't care. Her mind was screaming. Leonardo had stolen her past, had stolen her life, and she had let him. She had lived in his world, played his game, let herself believe that there was something, anything, human beneath his cold exterior. But there wasn't. There never had been. She reached the penthouse, shoving past security, ignoring their protests. Her hands were shaking as she slammed open the doors, stepping into the gilded prison she had called home. And there he was. Leonardo. Faraz, standing near the bar, pouring himself a drink, as if the world wasn't falling apart around them. He barely looked up. You're soaked, he murmured, swirling the whiskey in his glass. You'll catch a cold. Isabella saw red. With a furious scream, she grabbed the nearest vase and threw it. Across the room, it shattered against the wall, pieces raining down like broken promises. Leonardo finally looked at her, and when he did, she saw it. He knew why she was here. She didn't have to say a word. Still, you killed him. Silence. Leonardo didn't flinch, didn't deny it, and that was worse than anything. Tears burned her eyes. You killed Matteo. You tried to kill me. Leonardo exhaled slowly, setting his glass down. Her breath caught. No? She repeated, her voice shaking. That's all you have to say? He took a step forward. I didn't kill Matteo, he said, his voice eerily calm. But I didn't stop it either. The air vanished from her lungs. She stumbled back. You let it happen. Leonardo's jaw tightened. I was supposed to take his place. He was the golden boy, the one everyone loved. I was nothing but a shadow, waiting in the wings. His voice darkened. And then he met you. Her blood ran cold. Matteo was going to throw everything away for you, he continued, his words like daggers. He was going to walk away, Expose the family. Do you know what that would have meant? Isabella's pulse pounded. She did know. It would have meant ruin. The Faraz name would have crumbled. Their empire would have burned. Leonardo let out a slow, bitter laugh. They gave me a choice, he murmured. Either I let them handle it, or I would lose everything too. Isabella's hands trembled. Handling it, she whispered. You mean? Leonardo's eyes darkened. You were supposed to die in that car, he said. Both of you. Tears slipped down her cheeks. She had fought so hard to remember, and now she wished she never had. Leonardo took another step forward. But you survived, he murmured, and for 8 years, I thought you were gone, until I saw you again. Her breath hitched, and suddenly, everything clicked. The bet, the marriage. It had never been about winning. It had been about containing her, making sure she never remembered. Rage exploded inside her. You stole my life, she whispered. Leonardo's expression didn't change. I saved you. She laughed. A hollow, broken sound. You saved yourself. Silence. Then softly, yes, I did. Her heart shattered. This was it, the final betrayal. And she had walked straight into it. She stepped back, shaking her head. I was right about you. Leonardo watched her carefully. And what? Was that? She lifted her chin, swallowing the sob that threatened to break free. You're a monster. For the first time, something flickered in his eyes. Something raw. Something almost human. But it was too late. She turned, walking away. Leonardo didn't stop her. Didn't call her name. Didn't fight. And that, more than anything, proved that she had never mattered at all. The night was heavy with silence. Leonardo stood in the empty penthouse, staring at the shattered vase on the floor, whiskey untouched in his hand. The room felt hollow without her, the absence of her presence settling over him like a weight he couldn't shake. She was gone, and he had let her go. Isabella didn't stop running until her legs gave out. The city blurred around her, lights flashing, horns blaring. But she heard none of it. All she could hear was his voice. I didn't kill Matteo, but I didn't stop it either. She had spent years believing she had simply been unlucky, that she had fallen through the cracks of society, that fate had been cruel but random. But now she knew the truth. Leonardo Faraz had stolen everything from her, and she had let him touch her, let him own her, let him break her, again and again, without even knowing why. Tears burned in her eyes. She should have killed him. She wanted to kill him. And yet, she still felt his hands on her skin, still saw the flicker of regret in his eyes, still heard the way his voice had cracked when he had said, I don't know how to let you go. A sob tore through her chest. She hated him. She hated that even now, a part of her wanted to understand him, but there was no understanding a monster. There was only revenge. And she would make sure Leonardo Faraz paid for everything he had done. Leonardo sat in the dark, the ice in his glass long melted. He had spent years telling himself it hadn't mattered. That Matteo had made his choice. That Isabella had been collateral damage. That she had never mattered. But watching her walk away had felt like a blade straight to his chest. Because she had mattered. More than she ever should have. And now, she would never forgive him. A knock echoed through the silence. Leonardo didn't move. He already knew who it was. The door opened, and Victoria Faraz stepped inside, her gaze sharp as steel. You've lost her, she said simply. Leonardo exhaled, rubbing his jaw. I know. Victoria studied him for a long moment. Then, softly, was it worth it? The answer should. The answer have been simple. Yes. She had been a threat. A loose end that needed to be tied. But as he sat there, staring at the city lights beyond the window, the truth settled over him like a death sentence. No, it hadn't been worth it. Because he had just lost the only thing that had ever made him feel alive. And there was no way to fix it now, because Isabella wasn't coming back. Not as the woman he had known. The next time he saw her, it would be as his enemy. And he had no doubt that she would destroy him. 1 month later, the city still belonged to Leonardo Faraz. His empire was intact, his fortune untouched. But he was a dead man walking. He saw it in the way people looked at him, his employees, his so-called friends. The whispers in the boardroom, the cautious glances. They all knew that something had changed, that he had lost. And then, one evening, she came back. Leonardo was in his office, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass. When the door swung open, he didn't need to turn around. He knew it was her. He had been waiting for this. Isabella stepped inside, her heels clicking against the marble floor. She was different now, stronger, untouchable. She no longer looked like a woman who had once been broken. She looked like a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ashes of what he had done to her. And she was here to end him. Leonardo poured himself a drink. "You look good," he murmured. She didn't respond. He finally turned, meeting her gaze. The warmth in her eyes was gone, and that was when he knew there was no saving this. She set something on his desk. A file. He didn't have to open it to know what it was. Evidence. Proof of everything. The crimes of the Ferraz family. The truth about Matteo's murder. The proof that would burn him to the ground. His throat tightened. "So that's why you're here." Isabella tilted her head. "Did you expect anything else?" Leonardo swallowed hard. Maybe. For the first time, something flickered in her expression. Something that hurt more than hatred. Disappointment. She exhaled, shaking her head. "You could have told me the truth from the beginning. You could have let me go. But instead, you caged me." Leonardo held her gaze. "And yet, you came back." She let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "No, Leonardo." She leaned down, pressing her palms against the desk. "I didn't come back. I came to bury you." His chest tightened. And yet, he smiled. Because for all the ways he had destroyed her, he had also made her unstoppable. And he wasn't even angry about it. If anything, he was proud. She picked up the file, turning to leave. But before she did, she looked back at him one last time. And that was when she said the words that finally killed him. "I loved you once." Leonardo's heart stopped. But now, she smiled softly. "Now I feel nothing." And with that, she walked away. The next morning, the headlines screamed his name. Billionaire Leonardo Ferraz under federal investigation. Dark secrets of the Ferraz empire exposed. And just like that, the empire he had sacrificed everything to protect was gone. 3 months later, a small beach town in Italy. Isabella sipped her coffee, watching the waves crash against the shore. The wind tangled in her hair. And for the first time in 8 years, she felt free. She had won. Leonardo Ferraz was nothing now. And yet, she still dreamed of him, of the way he had looked at her in the end. Like he had been waiting for her to pull the trigger, like he had wanted her to. She exhaled, setting down her cup. She had burned him to the ground, and yet, in the quiet of the morning, when the world wasn't watching, she wasn't sure why it didn't feel like victory, the end.